Two men have been executed in Iran for their role in last summer's post-election unrest. They were convicted of being enemies of God and trying to topple the Islamic establishment. The executions are thought to be the first related to protests that followed Mahmoud Ahmadinejad's re-election as president. 9 others have been sentenced to death on Thursday for their role in the violence. Let's go to Tehran and speak to Professor of Politics at Theran University, Mohammad Marandi. Thanks for being with us, Mohammad. 2 people sentenced to death. A total of 11 are now facing the death sentence. What's the reaction in Tehran to this?
Well, I think that since these 2 people are members of 2 different terrorist organizations, one the Mujahideen Khalq, MEK, and the other as a member of the Kingdom Assembly, which are funded by foreign governments. And the Mujahideen Khalq, as you know, was fighting alongside Saddam Hussein against Iran during the Iraq-Iran war. There isn't much sympathy for these people, these 2 who have been executed.
With all due respect,
but I think that there's
Mohammed, with all due respect, Human Rights Watch, the human rights group, has said this week that these trials were simply show trials, that there's evidence that many of those arrested have been coerced into giving confessions, and there's evidence that some were tortured. How can these trials be taken seriously?
Well, I'm not very much familiar with the case. Human Rights Watch would obviously, and Amnesty, they are ideologically bound to the West, and Iran is regularly condemned by them. It has been over the last 30 years. Even during the time when Mr. Mousavi was Prime Minister of Iran, he was regularly, and Iran was regularly condemned. But the fact that these terrorist organizations were involved is something that they themselves have admitted. The MEK had stated that they will be involved in, and that they were involved in the events in Tehran. And since the members of this organization were part of an armed rebellion against the country, and they fought alongside Saddam Hussein, there really isn't any sympathy for them.
But my point is, if coercion is suspected in any way, doesn't that simply inflame the situation in Iran, and doesn't that galvanize the reform movement?
No, because I think that, first of all, the reformists, mainstream of reformists, have distanced themselves from the Green Movement and from the terrorist organizations that have involved themselves in the unrest in Tehran. Most of the mainstream players, for example, the parliamentarians, Mr. Tabish, Mr. Kawakibian, and others, they have basically completely distanced themselves from these people. So the reformist movement is there. Whether there was coercion or not, I think that is something that's based, these are accusations made by Western powers. I don't think that everyone in Iran would agree with that. But in general, there is very little sympathy towards these terrorist organizations, and I think that nowadays especially it is important for Western countries to recognize that the reformist movement is not the same thing as the Green Wave or as the MEK and others.
The trouble is, Mohammed, it's very difficult to verify any claims coming out of Tehran, because Tehran has banned Iranians from contacting certain international reporters, human rights groups. I mean, it raises the question, why is it doing that if everything is above board?
Well, Iran has always had a very problematic experience with the Western media, and they too have the Iranians themselves have grievances with regards to the Western powers and Western governments and Western media. But I also think one has to take into account the fact that in Iran there are very diverse views. The parliament is very much involved in expecting prisons and the post-election events. The parliament has a very different position from that of the president, and the judiciary is also independent of the government. There are very different and diverse players at play, and while they have enormous differences, and when, let's say, torture or when people have been beaten or killed, it has been brought out, and people are now, for example, in Kahrizak, those people who abused the prisoners, and 3 or 4 people who were killed as a result, they are now in prison. Some of them are high-ranking police officers. They will be punished. And Parliament is satisfied with the way things are going. In fact, the father of one of those people who was killed spoke to me and said he was very satisfied with the way things have progressed so far.
Okay,
so I really think that the Western media, when it comes to Iran, is not very...
Well, that's the point I want to pick up on. Just stay there for 1 minute. I just want to get your reaction to this. President Barack Obama, of course, gave his State of the Union address. He did touch on Iran, and this is what he had to say.
The international community is more united, and the Islamic Republic of Iran is more isolated. And as Iran's leaders continue to ignore their obligations, there should be no doubt they, too, will face growing consequences. That is a promise.
President Obama there saying Iran is becoming more isolated. Do you feel more isolated sitting there in Tehran?
No, I think there are a number of problems with what he said. Before that, he also claimed that Iran is pursuing nuclear weapons, and that runs against what the International Atomic Energy Agency has been saying for years. So I think many Iranians will see him as being dishonest here. And also, I think that basically Iran's problem is with the United States and a number of Western European powers and Israel, and that most of the international community, such as the Non-Aligned Movement and the Organization for the Islamic Conference, these are all organizations that have backed Iran, and they consist of the majority of the world's people and the countries of the world. Also, he has said that he will support, the opposition, meaning not the reformists, but those who are now, such as the Mujahideen Khalq and those who have participated in the Ashura riots. And I think that itself is saying that the United States will continue to interfere in Iranian internal affairs and continue to fund television channels and websites and organizations, whether terrorists or other organizations, against Iran. And that is just going to make Iranians more angry towards the United States, and the chances for rapprochement will be more difficult, especially at a time when the United States really needs Iran much more than Iran needs the United States because of all the troubles that it is facing in Afghanistan and in the region at large.
Okay, Mohammad, thank you very much indeed for your perspective there. Mohammad Marandi speaking to us from Tehran.